Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The room smelled of antiseptic, dimly lit with flickers of harsh white light overhead. Curtains swayed slightly in the breeze of an oscillating fan, and the only sound beyond the beeping machines was the soft whimper of a newborn. Success lay still on the narrow hospital bed, her head turned toward the small cot beside her. Her baby, just a few hours old, slept soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the world she had just entered. A nurse moved quietly around the room, adjusting an IV drip, noting something on a clipboard. Then she approached with a lowered gaze. "Madam," she said gently in Igbo-accented English, "your husband say he no day come again. Him say dem tell am na girl." Success blinked, her eyes slow to absorb the words. "He say make we no disturb him." The nurse added this with a hesitant shrug before turning and walking out. That was it. No flowers. No embrace. No voice asking if she was okay. Just that blank space where her husband's presence should have been. A silence so deep it pressed against her skin like cold iron. She did not cry immediately. The tears waited like guests unsure of when to arrive. Instead, Success reached for her daughter and pulled her close, pressing her lips to the soft, wrinkled forehead. The child stirred and nestled closer to her mother's warmth. In that moment, Success closed her eyes and whispered something too broken to be called a prayer. She didn't understand why God would let joy be followed by abandonment. She had carried the pregnancy with so much hope, carefully avoiding stress, praying every morning, even whispering words to her belly in the quiet hours of dawn. Charles had smiled more during those months than he had in years, hinting about painting the baby's room blue, calling her his redeemer. He was certain this one would be a boy. Everyone in his family was. When the scan suggested otherwise, Success had hidden it. Not because she wanted to deceive, but because she feared the disappointment would ruin everything too soon. And now, here she was, holding the proof of her own failure, not in her eyes, but in theirs. A beautiful, healthy child wrapped in a pink cloth, met with rejection. The nurse returned an hour later with a receipt in her hand. "Your friend, Uncle Tayo, he don't pay the bill. He talk say make them discharge you." That was when the tears came, hot and endless, soaking the baby's cloth and refusing to stop. Leaving the hospital felt like walking into a war zone. Success clutched the baby tightly as they stepped into the waiting tricycle, her stitches burning with every bump on the road. The house came into view like a memory she no longer wished to keep. Gray, familiar, and full of shadows. At the door, her mother-in-law stood like a gatekeeper of pain. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply eyed the baby, clicked her tongue, and said, "So, not girl again? God forbid bad thing. You no be real woman at all. Your womb done curse. You want turn my son to father of only girls." Success didn't answer. She couldn't. Her lips trembled, and her knees buckled slightly, but she found her footing. Inside the house, no one helped her undress or clean the baby. Her room, once hers and Charles's, now felt like borrowed space. His voice wasn't there, just a heavy presence of judgment and disappointment in every corner. She sat on the edge of the bed, the baby on her chest, and exhaled slowly. This wasn't home anymore. This was survival. Mornings in the household began with sharp voices and the clatter of pots. Success often woke before dawn, not because the baby demanded it, but because peace did not exist in sleep. The cries of her newborn daughter were quickly shushed, not with care, but with panic. She didn't want the child's voice to stir Charles's mother, Mama Ego, or his younger sister, Ujanwa, who both now moved through the house as though they owned it. The compound buzzed with their presence. Ujanwa's loud music and high-pitched phone calls, Mama Ego's gossip with neighbors echoing through the open windows. Success moved like a ghost between them, nursing her child in corners, cooking in silence, washing clothes by hand because the washing machine had been reserved for more important needs. Every act of care she performed for her child came with the price of someone's scoff or sneer. She did not complain, not when Mama Ego accused her of spending too much water to bathe one useless Pekin, not when Eugenua dropped insults wrapped in laughter like "you forborn goat, at least he no go cry this much." She endured 1 hour at a time. Charles had become a shadow that only passed through in the evenings. When he arrived from work, he barely noticed if dinner was set or if his wife had eaten. Most nights, he nodded briefly to his mother and retreated into the bedroom, closing the door without looking at Success or the child. Mama Ego would then sigh loudly and make dramatic statements like, "I don't blame him. Which man go day happy with this kind woman? Only daughters full everywhere like sand." On such nights, Success often sat alone in the passageway, her newborn sleeping across her lap, as she listened to the faint sounds of a family she no longer belonged to. She wanted to grieve, but the grief never came in full. It dripped slowly into her chest, thick, steady, and unrelenting. Once she tried to talk to Charles, standing at the door with trembling hands and tired eyes, asking gently if they could speak. He looked past her as though she were part of the wall. "Later," he muttered and brushed past. That later never came. Instead, what came were more rules, more boundaries, a new toothbrush for himself, a blanket folded on the floor, hers now. The shift was subtle, but it screamed in her bones. As the weeks turned into months, Success stopped expecting help or kindness from anyone in the house. Her body was still healing, but there was no room for rest. Charles's sisters took over the living room and kitchen, always claiming they were supporting their brother through her failure. Even her own children were subtly discouraged from showing her affection in public, as if love for their mother was shameful. One afternoon, while sweeping the corridor, Success heard Eugenua speaking to a visitor, her voice mocking. She day their day pray like say now prayer go turn girl to boy. Not only prayer she sobby. The words lodged deep in her chest. That night she didn't eat. She simply sat in the dark with her baby, rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby too old for her age. But even in that silence, a seed remained, small, buried under shame and exhaustion, but alive. It whispered something her lips hadn't yet found the courage to say, "You are not finished." Though no one else in that house saw it, though the mirror didn't reflect it, that whisper clung to her. And in the eyes of her little girls, who watched everything from behind hallway doors, it had already begun to bloom. The rainy season crept in without warning. Thunder rolled in the distance one evening as the wind pushed against the fragile windows. Success had just managed to lull the baby to sleep after hours of gentle rocking and whispered tunes when the door creaked open. Her eldest daughter, Adise, now 7, stepped inside barefoot. She clutched a faded piece of cloth against her chest, her eyes unusually quiet for her age. Success looked up from the mattress where she had just laid her child, and Adise walked toward her without speaking. She climbed onto the bed, slipped beneath the wrapper her mother had spread, and rested her head gently on her mother's shoulder. Success didn't ask questions. She only wrapped her arm around the girl and sighed, her body sore from the day's chores, her mind frayed. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof. It was Adise who broke the silence. "Mummy, are you still sad?" Her voice was small, curious, not intrusive. Success swallowed the lump rising in her throat and whispered, "I'm just tired." The girl nodded slowly, then said something that made her mother still completely. "Don't worry. One day, we will all grow up and make you proud, so proud that Daddy will see what he threw away." That night, after the house had gone to sleep, Success lay awake with those words echoing in her ears. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers gently stroking Adise's hair as the child slept beside her. There had been no ceremony in her daughter's words, No overconfidence, just the quiet determination of a child who had seen too much and felt too deeply. It wasn't just Addis who noticed the tension. Even little Chidinma, the middle child, had begun to withdraw. She used to laugh easily, always humming as she played with torn doll pieces, but now her laughter was brief, unsure. And Zara, the baby, though too young to understand, always clung to success tighter whenever voices rose in the house. It was in these silent recognitions, these small shifts in behavior, that Success realized her daughters had been watching her pain closely, collecting it like breadcrumbs. She had tried to shield them, smiled for them, masked her cries, but children knew. They always knew. And now they were beginning to draw their own lines, deciding where their loyalty lived, even when their hearts still craved their father's attention. In the weeks that followed, the girls' bond with their mother began to thicken like strong rope, unseen but unbreakable. Success didn't encourage their anger. She didn't whisper bitterness into their ears or turn them into allies in her suffering. But still, something unspoken passed between them. They had begun doing small things without being asked, bringing her water, adjusting the wrapper around the baby when it slipped, standing protectively near her when Mama Ego's voice rose in the background. One Saturday evening, as they sat on a mat outside the back kitchen peeling beans, Chidinma said, "Mommy, if we become doctors and lawyers and famous women, will Grandma still say we are not enough?" Success paused, the knife still in her hand, the weight of her daughter's question falling heavy in her chest. She didn't have an answer, at least not the kind that would heal a child. But she leaned in, pressed her forehead gently to Chidinma's, and whispered, "You don't have to prove anything to anybody. But if you must prove something, let it be that love can grow from broken things." The children didn't speak again, but they peeled faster, stronger, their little hands moving with purpose. The days grew heavier as the girls entered their school years, each one marked not just by the weight of books and uniforms, but by the quiet rules that governed their home. There were invisible boundaries, places where their voices must not rise, rooms they could not linger in for too long, eyes they had to avoid. At school, their teachers often praised them. Odessa was quick with numbers, her hand always the first to shoot up in class. Chidinma had a gift for stories, her essays filled with the kind of imagery that made her teacher pause mid-marking. Little Zara, though still in primary one, already read at the level of pupils much older. But each afternoon when the bell rang, their steps grew slower. They didn't rush home like other children. They walked in silence, their school shoes crunching over gravel, their bags bumping against their backs, preparing themselves for the change in air, the shift from laughter to measured silence. The compound always felt colder when they returned, even under the afternoon sun. Yujungwa's voice was usually the first to greet them, sharp, mocking, a constant reminder that they didn't belong to Joy. "Welcome, future madams," she would sneer. "Una done go learn how to cry for office?" The girls never answered. They just slipped into the house and found their mother, whose tired smile waited for them like a shelter. Over time, they learned to read the silence between their parents. Charles, when present, spoke little to them. His presence in the house was more like a heavy door, closed, distant, and always cold. He came in smelling of outside air and perfume, not pausing to ask about their day or notice the drawings stuck on the refrigerator with tape. They often caught him staring at their mother with the kind of indifference that could freeze a river. Once, after Zara ran up to him with a school certificate, he took it without looking and placed it on a table where receipts and old newspapers gathered dust. He didn't speak to her for the rest of the evening. The girls never talked about it directly, but each time such moments happened, they huddled a little closer in their shared room at night, whispering quietly under the covers. They began to create stories about a future where they would own houses, build businesses, buy a car for their mother, travel the world. Sometimes they drew pictures of these dreams and pinned them to the inside of their wardrobe. Each time they added something new, they looked at each other and smiled, not because they believed it would be easy, but because they had already decided it would happen. One evening, Adiz returned from school with a bruised elbow and a quiet rage in her eyes. She had gotten into a fight with a boy who mocked her for not having a brother. "Your mama no sabi born boy. That means your papa no go love Una," he had said with a smirk. She hadn't even thought before her fist landed on his face. That night, as Success gently applied balm to her daughter's wound, Adiz looked up and asked, "Is it true that Daddy doesn't love us?" Success froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the cloth into the bruise, but her voice was calm when she answered, "You are worth more than anyone's love or their absence." The words didn't fix the hurt, but they laid a stone, one more piece in the foundation her daughters were building beneath their feet. The next morning, Chidinma tucked Eddie's hand in hers as they left for school and whispered, "Don't worry. One day we'll be so great he won't matter." They walked ahead without looking back, their heads held a little higher, their hearts still sore, but stitched with quiet fire. Charles sat at the far end of the living room, barely blinking as the television flickered with the evening news. His tie hung loosely around his neck, his shirt stained faintly at the collar with the sweat of a long day. Beside him, the untouched plate of rice and stew had gone cold. His phone buzzed on the table for the third time, but he ignored it. His thoughts weren't on the news or his meal. They were tangled in the memory of a meeting earlier that afternoon, one that left him more disturbed than he'd admit. The contractor he had trusted for months had failed him. A deal worth millions collapsed like sand in the wind, and with it, a long stretch of future plans. The betrayal came from a man he called brother, someone he had joked with, drank with, defended in boardrooms. Now, that man was gone, the money gone, and the silence that followed was loud enough to sit with him at the table. For the first time in years, Charles found himself staring into nothing, not because he was tired, but because something had cracked open, a doubt he had long buried beneath pride and belief in male loyalty. He didn't speak of it when Mama Ego asked if everything was all right. He only nodded and waved her away, sinking deeper into thought. The house felt different that night, though nothing had physically changed. Charles noticed, almost absently, that the kitchen smelled faintly of pepper soup, and that the living room curtains had been washed. He hadn't paid attention to these things in years, yet now they stood out. He heard faint laughter from the girls' room, laughter rich and unbothered, and it tugged at something in him. He walked slowly toward their door, but didn't enter. From the narrow crack, he saw the three of them seated on the floor, a stack of books between them, a shared torchlight balanced against the wall. Chidinma was explaining something about biology, her hands moving as she spoke. Zara nodded eagerly, her lips forming silent repetitions. Adise was taking notes. There was a rhythm between them, a closeness that excluded the rest of the world, including him. He stepped back before they saw him. In the corridor, he paused and looked at the photographs hung unevenly on the wall. Most were faded school portraits, none of which he remembered hanging. His name wasn't written on any of their award certificates stuck above the TV. It struck him suddenly how unfamiliar his own house had become, not because of Success or her daughters, but because he had never tried to truly belong. By morning, Charles was gone again, off to meetings and phone calls, but something had shifted, even if subtly. He started coming home earlier, not because he wanted to, but because a silent need had begun to gnaw at him. He watched from a distance as his daughters moved through the house with quiet efficiency, sweeping, cooking, reading, and praying in low voices with their mother. He still said little to them, unsure of how to enter a world he had spent years avoiding. When his friends asked how the girls were, he'd smile and say, "They're doing okay," with a proud tilt of his head, as if he had earned the right to that pride. But he didn't know how to ask Chidinma what her latest story was about, or congratulate Adiz on her scholarship. And Zara, she barely looked at him unless he spoke first, which he rarely did. The weight of absence was heavy, heavier now that he knew he had placed it there himself. But pride held his tongue still. He began to linger in the car after parking at night, watching the windows glow with light, hearing faint music drift out. It looked like a home, sounded like a home. But he, the man who built it, wasn't sure if he could walk through the door and truly be welcome inside. The mornings were quieter now, not because the house had grown peaceful, but because everyone had learned to live around the noise. Success no longer waited for kindness. She moved with intention, packing Zara's lunchbox with firm hands, reminding Chidinma not to forget her chemistry notebook, ironing Adiz's shirt while reciting her prayer in silence. Her daughters had grown taller, their bodies stretching into new shapes, their minds sharper with each day. There was little time for small talk. Mornings were for catching buses, reviewing exam dates, calculating grocery needs against a tight budget. Success had picked up sewing again. Nothing fancy, just adjustments and patching worn uniforms for neighborhood children, the little jobs that earned her something. Charles still lived in the same house, slept in the same room across the corridor, but he had become like a guest no one knew how to host. His movements were predictable, early departures, late returns, heavy silences. He never asked questions about the girl's progress, but every now and then Success would catch him glancing at the certificate wall before he walked out the door, his eyes scanning it like a stranger reading the achievements of someone else's children. The girls, now in their late teens and early 20s, had found their rhythm. Adiz was interning at a law chamber in the city, her gait brisk, her words deliberate. Chidinma, admitted into a federal university, had already begun building a blog where she shared essays that stirred emotions, even in strangers. Zara, though the youngest, was preparing for her final secondary school exams with the intensity of someone racing toward freedom. Their bond with each other had only deepened. At night, when they were home together, the kitchen glowed with warmth. 3 girls cooking, arguing over seasoning, sharing stories from their day. Sometimes they pulled Success in, dragging her from the sitting room to taste their efforts or weigh in on whose stew tasted better. She laughed more now, not the loud laugh of joy, but the soft one of surviving, of watching life return to her in the form of her daughters. She didn't speak often about the early years. She didn't need to. The girls carried those memories in their bones, and every small act of love they showed her felt like a reply to the pain they had once watched her endure. Charles noticed, not in grand revelations, but in quiet acknowledgments that unsettled him. His business partners had begun to mention his daughters in passing. "You're lucky, Charles. Not every girl turns out this well." He would smile, say something vague like, "Their mother did a good job," but the words tasted strange in his mouth. He had not earned the praise, and he knew it. Sometimes he sat in his car with the engine running, listening to the echo of their laughter from the living room, the clinking of plates, the joy that moved without needing him. One Sunday afternoon, he returned home to find the compound freshly swept, flower pots arranged at the entrance. Inside, the sitting room had been rearranged, pictures reframed, curtains changed. On the wall was a new framed photo, Success seated proudly in the middle, her daughters flanking her in matching Ankara dresses. There was no space left beside them for him, and none had been reserved. He stood before it for a long time, then turned away without a word. The house was full of life, of women who had grown in his absence, and though he walked through its rooms, the warmth never reached him. Not yet. The sun was high the day Adiz brought home her first official salary. Not an allowance, not a stipend from school, but a real paycheck earned from her long hours at the law firm. She didn't make an announcement. Instead, she quietly entered the kitchen where Success was peeling yam and laid a crisp envelope on the table. "For you, Mummy," she said simply, before moving to wash her hands. Success didn't speak immediately. She stared at the envelope like it held something sacred. When she opened it and saw the modest sum inside, tears rose behind her eyes, not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. This was fruit. Fruit from years watered with struggle, silence, and sacrifice. That night she cooked okra soup with dried fish, Adaz's favorite, and the whole house ate together for the first time in a long while. They didn't call it a celebration, but in the quiet chewing, the occasional shared glance, and the laughter that bubbled out of Zara's stories, it felt like one. The girls had begun, in their own way, to carry her, not out of obligation, but out of a love that had survived lack, shame, and indifference. Outside that small home, the world was beginning to notice them. Chidinma's blog was shared by a local radio presenter who praised her voice as a rare one, honest, sharp, and moving. She started getting messages from young people who saw themselves in her writing. Zara won a scholarship for a science competition and was featured in a community newsletter. Adiz, now pursuing her law certification, was invited to speak on a panel for young women in leadership, and through it all, they brought everything home to their mother. They bought her a better fan when the heat became too much. They changed the old mattress she had endured for years. They even saved up bit by bit and helped her repaint the parlor, choosing a soft peach that brightened the room like morning light. Charles watched from a distance. He often came home later now, not out of habit, but because he felt like a visitor in his own space. He couldn't bring himself to ask who paid for what, who arranged what, or who hung the new curtains. He would hear the girls talking with success in soft, joyful tones behind closed doors and feel like he was eavesdropping on a family that had learned to breathe without him. One evening, when Chidinma was announced as a finalist in a nationwide writing competition, a few neighbors gathered to congratulate the family. Success stood at the center of it all, dressed in a wrapper and blouse stitched by one of her customers, her smile quiet but full. People clapped, praised her daughters, and spoke of how she must have raised them well. Charles sat in the corner, nodding politely, but the words stung. Not because they weren't true, but because they had never been meant for him. A man who once believed only sons could carry his name now watched his daughters carry the weight of legacy he had refused to share. That night, when the guests were gone and the compound fell into stillness, Charles walked past the girl's room and paused. The door was ajar. Inside, Success sat on the bed, surrounded by her daughters, their voices low as they planned something for the weekend. He could have stepped in. He could have said something. But instead, he turned away and walked to his own room, the sound of their laughter lingering behind him like a language he no longer understood. Charles stared at the pharmacy receipt in his hand, the paper soft and slightly damp with sweat. He had been coughing for days, a dry, relentless echo that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than his chest. At first he ignored it, just as he had ignored many things. But when the fever came and lingered, he finally went to the clinic alone. The nurse barely looked up as she handed him a small brown paper bag of medication, telling him to rest and drink plenty of water. No one at home asked where he had been. No one noticed the tired slouch in his shoulders or the hollow beneath his eyes. That evening, he sat on the edge of the bed in the room he now occupied by himself, listening to the sound of plates clinking in the kitchen, the soft hum of conversation floating in from the parlor. He was not missed, not needed. The home he had built now pulsed with a life that did not include him. He looked around the room, once vibrant with shared mornings and familiar scents, now silent, stiff, and filled with the memory of a man who used to be someone else. His mother and sister, the voices that once dominated the compound, were no longer present. Mama Ego had returned to her village 2 years ago after a bitter quarrel with one of the neighbors, and Yu Junwa had since married and moved out of state. There were no sharp voices to defend his absence anymore, no echo chamber to feed his pride. It was in this silence that Charles began to notice the life moving on without him. Adets rarely spoke when their paths crossed. She nodded with quiet politeness, but her eyes never lingered. Chidinma offered a stiff good evening, more out of duty than affection, and Zara, once the smallest of them, barely acknowledged him unless directly spoken to. He once tried to initiate conversation, asking Chidinma how school was going. She answered with short words and a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes. After that, he stopped trying. The girls weren't rude. They were simply distant. They had mastered the art of civility without attachment, presence without warmth. It was like watching rain fall outside your window, beautiful, rhythmic, and completely out of reach. Some nights, he wandered into the sitting room long after everyone had gone to bed. He would sit there in the dark, hands folded, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. Each image held a story he was not part of, a birthday celebration he didn't attend, a graduation he never congratulated, a trip they had taken without informing him. The house was full of them now, pictures and moments. He sometimes found himself whispering apologies to the silence, not loud enough for anyone to hear. The television would flicker with soft light, casting shadows on the wall, and he would think of the early years when he had felt powerful, needed, respected. Now, even his footsteps on the tiled floor seemed foreign, unwelcome. He thought of calling his daughters together, of gathering the courage to say he was sorry, to beg for a second chance. But something always stopped him, pride, fear, shame. He would retreat to his room again, the cough still rattling in his chest, the weight of his own absence finally settling into his bones. The house moved on without him, and for the first time, Charles realized that loneliness was not always loud. It could be quiet, gentle, and slowly permanent. It was a Thursday evening when Charles finally gathered the courage to ask them. Not all at once, not with drama or declarations, just a quiet, cautious voice that floated into the air like dust after years of silence. The girls had returned from their day's routines, and the house was filled with the usual soft sounds of movement. Chidinma humming faintly from the kitchen, Zara setting the table, Addis speaking lowly on a call near the veranda. Success sat in the corner of the parlor, peeling garden eggs into a plastic bowl. Charles stood awkwardly by the hallway entrance, one hand on the wall, the other fiddling with the hem of his shirt. His voice came out strained. "Can I speak with all of you, please?" The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that isn't confused, but waited with history. Success looked up first, her eyes tired but not surprised. She wiped her hands on a napkin and called out softly, "Girls, come." One by one they entered, none of them rushing, none of them reluctant. They sat not beside him, but near their mother, their faces unreadable. He remained standing. For a long moment he said nothing. The words stuck somewhere between guilt and fear. Then he exhaled and said, "I know I failed you. I failed all of you." His voice cracked as he continued, not because he rehearsed it, but because it was the first time he allowed himself to feel the weight of his absence. He didn't list excuses. He didn't blame tradition or pride. He simply admitted it, that he had chosen distance, that he had clung to the wrong things, that he had hurt them and watched them grow without offering the one thing every child deserves, a father's presence. Addis didn't cry. Her arms were folded tightly, her eyes fixed on a spot just above his head. Chidinma blinked slowly, like she was cataloging his words, storing them for examination later. Zara looked down at her lap, her toes curling into the rug beneath her feet. None of them interrupted. When he finished, there was no applause, no rushing into arms. Just silence. Then Success, her voice low, said, "They heard you." And that was all. No promises, no warmth, only acknowledgement. It stung more than anger would have. Because it was clear, his daughters had already grown roots in a world where he was not needed for their strength. They had learned to rise without him, and now he was asking to be seen not as their father, but as a man who wanted back into a life he had once walked away from. In the days that followed, nothing visibly changed. The girls still moved through the house with their rhythm, still laughed with their mother, and whispered secrets between chores. But there were tiny shifts. Zara left his cup on the table one evening after serving tea to everyone else. Chidinma, when returning from school, greeted him without waiting to be prompted. Adaze once corrected a neighbor who tried to blame Charles's absence on spiritual issues and said flatly, he made his choices. Still, the softness that came with deep love remained distant. It wasn't anger that kept them guarded. It was memory. The memory of birthdays missed, of bruised questions never answered, of long nights where a child's small heart had waited for a door to open that never did. Charles had to learn to live with that, to understand that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. He began to help in little ways, quietly fixing a leaking tap, leaving money on the table without explanation, offering a ride when someone needed it. He did not expect thanks. And slowly, he began to understand. Rebuilding trust wasn't like fixing a broken pipe or repainting a wall. It wasn't something you completed. It was something you earned daily, through presence, patience, and the willingness to be invisible while healing took its time. The hall was warm with light, the kind that turned polished floors golden and made even quiet footsteps echo with purpose. Rows of chairs were filled with people, family, mentors, guests, and curious strangers, all waiting for the commencement of an award ceremony that had drawn notable figures across the state. 3 names were on everyone's lips, repeated in soft murmurs and proud whispers: Adiz, Chidinma, and Zara. The organizers called them the Okizi sisters, a trio of young women making waves in their respective fields: law, literature, and science. Cameras flashed as they arrived together, arm in arm, all 3 dressed in graceful Ankara gowns that shimmered under the lights. But the woman they held at the center, Success, stood out most of all. Her head tie was modest, her shoes simple, but her presence was radiant. She walked between her daughters like a quiet flame, steady, revered. The applause began even before their names were announced officially. People had heard pieces of their story, though not all the pain behind it. What they saw now was the beauty that had grown out of a buried storm. Charles sat near the back of the hall, not by invitation, but with quiet permission. He had not known what to wear. In the end, he chose a plain white native, freshly ironed, his cap folded neatly in his hand. No one had saved him a seat near the front. He didn't expect him to. From where he sat, he could see them all clearly, the daughters he had once overlooked, now commanding a stage he could never have imagined. When Adiz was called to speak on behalf of her sisters, she walked to the podium with steady steps, a calm smile resting on her lips. Her speech was graceful, thanking mentors, community leaders, their late grandmother, and then her mother. "We are who we are today," she said, her voice unwavering, because of a woman who chose resilience when silence would have been easier. Everything we know of strength, of grace, of faith, we learned by watching her. The crowd erupted in applause. Charles swallowed hard, his eyes burning. She had not mentioned him, not even once. And yet, he knew she wasn't being cruel. She was being truthful. After the ceremony, people clustered around the sisters, taking photos, offering handshakes, asking for autographs. Charles remained seated for a long while, watching the stream of admiration flow toward his children and their mother. He did not interrupt. Eventually, when the hall began to empty, he stood and approached slowly. From a few steps away, he called out, "Success!" She turned, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, there was no anger in hers, just stillness. He nodded slightly, then turned to the girls. "Well done," he said, his voice low. "I mean it." Ade smiled politely. Chidinma gave a gentle nod, and Zara whispered a quiet thank you. No one hugged him, but no one turned away either. And that was enough for now. They returned to their car together, Success in the middle again, their laughter rising like birdsong into the night. Charles stood in the parking lot, watching their figures retreat into the darkness. He wasn't sure if he would ever be part of their light, but for the first time, he didn't resent it. He was simply grateful that, even from a distance, he could finally. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.